Before watching this video, I strongly recommend first viewing the previous one on the art of Splatoon, as this is not a self-contained review but rather part 2 of 5 covering the series as a whole. So it's a good idea to watch the other parts as well if you want the full understanding of this book, because I've spread it out across a series so I'm not just repeating the same stuff for each book, but will of course be commenting on the aspects unique to this one in this video. So The Art of Splatoon 1 was a great, fun, interesting book, and best of all, clearly had passion behind it, yet still had a lot of missteps, and perhaps was a little too distant from what one expects for the content of an art book. And though I appreciated that initiative and novelty, The Art of Splatoon 2 brings things back to a more traditionally art-focused experience. It was released in Japanese in 2017 and English 2 years later. It is a hefty book indeed, with 380 pages, which is a great number and pretty much the max for an art book. The problem though, and this is actually the only unimpressive thing the book does, so we might as well get it out of the way, and that is the wildly inconsistent hit-and-miss layout and use of space we saw in the first book continues here. Many pages are super packed with so much content, and it's great, if maybe even too crammed in some instances, but there's also way too many pages that are the complete opposite. Too spacious, too little content. And look, this book does have a massive amount of content, but is it proportional to its page count? Less so than it should, but still better than what we see for most art books. I suppose it's just disappointment in the jarring fluctuation in how concerned and astute they are when it comes to providing as much content as possible. However, one reason the size and layout is difficult to assess in this situation is because of the differing page sizes between the Japanese and English editions. The Japanese books are paperback and the pages are about 18 by 25 centimeters, so B5, which tends to be the typical art book size in Japan, whereas the English version is hardcover and is like 22 by 31 centimeters, so a little bigger than A4, which is a significant difference. Those sizes are also different ratios, however, except for the occasional giant top and bottom margins, the impact on the images is negligible. The layout and content are otherwise identical, but it means, do you judge it based on the smaller Japanese pages for which it was originally designed versus how that translates to the larger English pages? Because some images that were full page or empty margins that were fine in the original are now unnecessarily wasteful in the larger format. Likewise, pages where so much was crammed in that they were too small are now much better. Ultimately, neither format is perfectly used. However, all things considered, the English edition is unquestionably the better option, and Dark Horse's decision to enlarge it was a very good move in fixing one of the issues with the originals. So it is hard to judge, yet there are some bumps in the road with layout and content density regardless of the format. For example, single images taking up a whole spread. Likewise, I was underwhelmed by the location showcase in the first book. Here, while they have improved in how many pages have been allocated, sadly the world and stage art still feels lacking and that you're missing out on a lot, because it has not improved in terms of use of space, occasional bizarrely mundane curation, and worst of all, rampant unnecessary gutter crossing spoiling many of the book's best images. The thing I've really come to love about Splatoon is not only the visual style, but the incredible attention to detail in its world building. So it's cool that those two things are also the defining characteristics of this book too. In terms of the visual style, you can see that for yourself, but as for attention to detail, the art, design notes, and even the curation are often very, very focused on that. So I want to emphasize it because not only is the focus on detail a huge part of the experience of this book, but also because it's a double-edged sword. On one side, it's fascinating to see just how much incredibly high effort and attention to detail is in the thought behind every aspect of the world and its designs. But the downside is that it can feel excessive, boring, and not the best use of the book's space when you have one design being shown from every angle and having all its components broken down, or design variations with only the pettiest differences. It can feel like it's missing the forest for the sake of too few trees. There's not a whole lot of text in the first two Splatoon books, but in subject matter, quality, and style, it varies wildly. There are basically two types of text. The first is what I'll call authored text, meaning stuff specifically written for the books. It's written in a kind of weird and inconsistent semi-in-world style. Mostly it's just brief explanations setting up what you're looking at, or just describing characters, locations, concepts, lore basically, but largely so shallow and banal that it's even uninteresting to someone like me who's new to this world. Really not worth including. The exception to this, however, as I am led to understand, is that the books do contain exclusive lore and details about the world and characters. I still get the impression that it's trivial at best, but for the Splatoon fanatic, it's not nothing. More enjoyable is the second type of text. You'll have seen little handwritten notes accompanying many of the pieces. I assume these are from the artist's original design documents, and although they are also frequently shallow or uninteresting, I still think they're a cool inclusion because it feels like an authentic behind-the-scenes look into the internal design communications and presentation of ideas. Also, it's far easier to excuse them because, unlike the authored text, they weren't written for an outside audience. Plus, often they are genuinely interesting, add context, insight, sometimes they're just funny, and mostly contribute to what I was saying before about obsessively engineered details. In terms of what this book offers, it's a lot easier to gauge from the flip through than the first one, but I'll point out some highlights. First of all, the biggest improvement from the first book is the presentation of clothing and gear. Here it's broken up into 3 different sections throughout the book. The first, in the character section, shows the actual artwork rather than the 3D models, the best being the proper concept artworks exploring looks and doing so via characters actually wearing them. After that come some isolated designs, but the biggest difference from the first book is that again, it's not just the final 3D models, it's the stuff homing in on the exact design options, blueprints, and details. And it's fine because it doesn't take up too many pages. It just feels like examples to show the variety and stages of the design process. That then continues into the clothing's final 3D form later in the book. So now we have got to the point where it's final 3D models, but still infinitely better handled than book 1, because not only is it characters actually modeling the stuff, but even better, it's all presented kinda like fashion catalog photography, with each spread being dedicated to one of the brands. In the first book I could see that they had created specific brands for this world, but here it's great to actually get a little description of each. I love what this displays in terms of books being created by people smart, willing, and skilled enough to make this sort of improvement and think creatively. Because on the one hand, the actual content of the imagery is still pretty boring in that it's largely just contemporary streetwear, but on the other it's such an important part of Splatoon's world and visual identity that you can't not have it represented in the art book. So it's a difficult situation, and I just love that they came up with a perfect creative solution for it. Very awesome that they made sure to include the sunken scrolls again. Now, the very last section of the book represents both the best and worst things about this series. So one of the biggest things I've praised the series for, and will continue to do so, is that they don't forget about art produced for things outside of the game, promotional and event illustrations and post-release content. And though they had a lot of that in the Splatoon 1 book, there was still art being produced after the book was published, and for most games in series it would be like, well, too bad, that stuff's never getting collected. What's great here is they haven't overlooked that, and have dedicated 50 pages of the Splatoon 2 art book to collecting Splatoon 1 content that didn't make it into the first book. That's awesome. Less awesome is that we also have the worst part of these books putting a dampener on that. Specifically, the layout is atrociously wasteful. It's honestly 15 pages of content spread over 50. Had it been either 50 pages worth of content, or even just what they have presented over 15-20 pages, I'd be ecstatic either way. It would probably be my favorite thing the book does, but to so needlessly waste 30 pages is very disappointing. Thankfully, this idea of collecting extra and post-release artwork being the series' best feature is allowed to gloriously fully embrace its ultimate form in the next Splatoon book, Hikara Walker, which is all about that.